In the 4th century, before the Common Era, when the great powers of China's warring states period competed for dominance through military force and strategic cunning, a problem emerged that would test the limits of conventional military thinking. The State of Wei, one of the most powerful kingdoms of the era, had laid siege to Handan, the capital of the state of Zhao. Wei's armies surrounded the city with overwhelming force, and conventional wisdom suggested that the only way to save Zhao would be to march an army directly to Handan and engage Wei's forces in a desperate battle for the city's survival. But a brilliant military strategist named Sun Bin saw the situation differently. He understood that the most direct path to solving a problem was not always the most effective path, that sometimes the best way to save a besieged city was not to go to that city at all, and that superior strategy could accomplish what superior force could not. This is the story of the Battle of Guiling, one of the most famous examples of indirect strategy in military history, and a demonstration of how brilliant thinking can transform an apparently hopeless situation into a decisive victory. To understand the genius of what Sun Bin accomplished at Guiling, we must first look at the world of the warring states and the strategic situation that created the crisis. By the middle of the 4th century, before the Common Era, the old Zhou dynasty that had once unified China existed only as a hollow shell. Real power belonged to 7 major states that competed ruthlessly for territory, resources, and ultimately for the right to unify China under their rule. These states were not merely rivals, they were existential threats to one another. Wars between them were total wars, where defeat could mean the complete destruction of a state and the massacre or enslavement of its population. Among these 7 great powers, Wei occupied a particularly strong position. Located in the Central Plains region, Wei controlled some of the most productive agricultural land in China. It had developed a professional military system that was considered the most advanced of the era. Wei's armies were well-trained, well-equipped, and led by capable generals who had studied the art of war intensively. Under the leadership of King Hui of Wei, the state had pursued an aggressive policy of expansion, seeking to dominate its neighbors and to position itself as the future unifier of China. The state of Zhao, by contrast, occupied territories to the north and northeast. Zhao was wealthy and powerful in its own right, but it lacked Wei's central position and its military advantages. Zhao's capital, Handan, was a great city and an important commercial center, but its location made it vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. When Wei decided to conquer Zhao, it committed a massive army to besieging Handan. The Wei general commanding the siege, Pang Juan, was one of the most respected military commanders of the era. He had studied warfare under the legendary teacher Guiguzi, and he was known for his tactical skill and his ruthless effectiveness. The siege of Handan was conducted with professional efficiency. Pang Juan's forces surrounded the city, cut off its supply lines, and began the systematic process of breaking down its defenses. The people of Handan faced the prospect of starvation if the siege continued, and the likelihood of massacre if the city fell. The Zhao government sent desperate appeals for help to its neighbors, but most of the other states were either allied with Wei, afraid of Wei's military power, or content to let Zhao and Wei exhaust each other while they watched from safety. The state of Qi, however, saw the situation differently. Qi was located to the east, along the coast, and it had its own rivalry with Wei. Qi's ruler and his advisors understood that if Wei conquered Zhao, Wei would become even more powerful and would pose a greater threat to Qi's own security. Moreover, Qi had an opportunity to weaken Wei without necessarily committing to a costly direct military confrontation. If Qi could find a way to force Wei to abandon the siege of Handan, it would accomplish multiple objectives. It would preserve Zhao as a buffer state, it would damage Wei's prestige and momentum, and it would demonstrate Qi's own power and strategic sophistication. The question was how to accomplish this. The conventional approach would be to march a Qi army to Handan, an attempt to break the siege through direct military engagement with Pang Juan's forces. But this approach carried significant risks. Pang Juan was a skilled general, commanding a powerful army on ground of his choosing. A direct confrontation might result in a costly stalemate, or even in a Qi defeat that would leave both Qi and Zhao weakened, while Wei remained strong. What was needed was a different approach, a strategy that would force Wei to abandon the siege without requiring a direct battle at Handan. It was at this point that Sun Bin entered the story. Sun Bin was one of the most remarkable figures in Chinese military history. He was a descendant of Sun Wu, the author of The Art of War, and he had inherited his ancestors' genius for strategic thinking. Sun Bin had studied warfare under the same master, Wei Guzi, who had taught Pang Juan. The two men had been fellow students, but their relationship had been poisoned by jealousy and rivalry. Pang Juan, recognizing that Sun Bin possessed superior strategic gifts, had arranged for Sun Bin to be punished for a false crime. Sun Bin had been subjected to mutilation. His feet had been amputated as punishment, which should have ended his military career and left him as a broken man, unable to serve in any meaningful capacity. But Sun Bin's strategic genius transcended his physical limitations. He had managed to escape from Wei and had made his way to Qi, where he entered the service of Tianji, a prominent Qi general. Tianji recognized Sun Bin's extraordinary abilities despite his physical disability, and he brought Sun Bin to the attention of King Wei of Qi. When the crisis over Handan arose, it was Sun Bin who was asked to devise a strategy for Qi's response. Sun Bin's analysis of the situation was characteristically brilliant. He understood that the real problem was not the siege of Handan itself, but rather the Wei army's presence at Handan. If that army could be made to leave Handan and return to Wei territory, the siege would be broken, without Qi having to fight a costly battle far from its own borders. The question was how to make Wei's army leave Handan. Sun Bin's answer was elegantly simple: attack Wei's own territory, specifically its capital at Daliang. If Wei's heartland was threatened, if the capital itself was in danger, then King Hui of Wei would have no choice but to recall Pang Juan's army from Handan to defend Wei's core territories. This strategy, which would later be summarized in the Chinese idiom besiege Wei to rescue Zhao, represented a fundamentally different way of thinking about military problems. Instead of addressing the problem directly, Sun Bin proposed to address the underlying cause of the problem. Instead of fighting where the enemy wanted to fight, he proposed to create a threat that would force the enemy to fight where and when Qi wanted them to fight. It was indirect strategy at its most sophisticated, and it required confidence that the strategic analysis was correct, and that Wei would respond in the predicted way. Tianji, commanding the Qi army with Sun Bin as his chief strategist, began to implement the plan. The Qi forces mobilized and marched not toward Handan, but toward Wei territory. They moved quickly and decisively, bypassing Wei's border fortifications and driving deep into Wei's heartland. Qi forces began to threaten key Wei cities and to move toward the capital at Daliang. The Qi army was not attempting to conquer Wei territory permanently. That would have required a much larger force and a longer campaign. Instead, they were creating a crisis that Wei could not ignore, a threat so immediate and so dangerous that it would force King Hui to recall his armies from their foreign adventures. The strategy worked exactly as Sun Bin had predicted. When news reached King Hui that Qi forces were threatening his capital, that Wei's heartland was in danger while his main army was hundreds of miles away besieging someone else's city, the king's priorities shifted immediately. The siege of Handan, which had seemed so important, suddenly became a secondary concern compared to the defense of Wei's own territory. King Hui sent urgent orders to Pang Juan to abandon the siege and return immediately to defend Wei's capital. Pang Juan, receiving these orders, found himself in an impossible situation. He had invested months in the siege of Handan. He was on the verge of achieving a major strategic victory that would have enhanced his reputation and strengthened Wei's position. But his king's orders were clear: abandon the siege and return home. Pang Juan had no choice but to comply. He broke off the siege and began marching his army back toward Wei territory at maximum speed. But Sun Bin had anticipated this response as well, and he had planned for the next phase of the campaign. Sun Bin understood that Pang Juan, forced to abandon a siege and march his army home in response to a crisis, would be under tremendous pressure to move quickly. Pang Juan would be concerned about the threat to Wei's capital. He would be anxious to engage the Qi forces before they could do more damage to Wei territory. He would be angry and frustrated at having been forced to abandon Handan. All of these factors would make Pang Juan less cautious, more aggressive, and more likely to make mistakes. Sun Bin selected a location for the confrontation carefully. Near the town of Guiling, there was terrain that favored defensive tactics, and that would allow a smaller, well-positioned force to engage a larger army on favorable terms. Sun Bin positioned the Qi army at Guiling and waited for Pang Juan to arrive. The wait was not long. Pang Juan, marching at high speed to confront the Qi forces that had threatened Wei's capital, arrived at Guiling to find the Qi army positioned and ready for battle. The Battle of Guiling itself was not as important as the strategy that had made the battle possible. What mattered was that Sun Bin had forced Pang Juan to fight on ground of Sun Bin's choosing, at a time when Pang Juan's forces were exhausted from their rapid march, and under circumstances where Pang Juan's judgment was clouded by frustration and urgency. The Wei forces, despite their professional training and their numerical advantages, found themselves unable to dislodge the Qi army from its defensive positions. The battle was hard fought, but the outcome was a significant Qi victory. Pang Juan's forces were defeated, and the general himself barely escaped with his life. The strategic consequences of Guiling extended far beyond the immediate battlefield results. The siege of Handan had been broken not through direct military intervention at Handan, but through indirect pressure that had forced Wei to abandon its objective. Zhao had been saved, without Qi having to commit to a costly campaign in Zhao territory. Wei's reputation for military invincibility had been damaged. Pang Juan's prestige had been diminished. And, perhaps most importantly, Sun Bin had demonstrated that there were strategic alternatives to the conventional approaches that most military commanders employed. The Battle of Guiling became one of the most studied military engagements in Chinese history, precisely because it illustrated principles that transcended the specific circumstances of the battle. Sun Bin had shown that indirect approaches could be more effective than direct ones. He had demonstrated that understanding an enemy's priorities and constraints could allow a smaller force to manipulate a larger one. He had proven that the objective of military strategy was not necessarily to destroy the enemy's army, but rather to accomplish political and strategic objectives, and that sometimes those objectives could be achieved without fighting the enemy's main force at all. The principle of besiege Wei to rescue Zhao became a fundamental concept in Chinese strategic thinking. It appeared in numerous military texts and treatises in the centuries that followed. It was applied in countless military campaigns. The basic insight that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is not to attack the problem directly, but rather to attack something else that will force your enemy to abandon their current course of action, proved to be applicable far beyond military affairs. It became relevant to diplomacy, to politics, to business strategy, and to any situation where indirect approaches might be more effective than direct confrontation. Sun Bin himself became legendary in Chinese culture. His story represented the triumph of intellect over physical limitation, of strategic brilliance over conventional military power, and of the possibility that even someone who had been victimized and broken could find a way to turn apparent weakness into strength. The fact that Sun Bin had been mutilated, that he had suffered a punishment that should have ended his career, and yet had gone on to become one of history's most successful military strategists, made his story particularly inspiring. The rivalry between Sun Bin and Pang Juan also became part of Chinese cultural memory. The two men, who had studied together under the same master, represented contrasting approaches to warfare and to life. Pang Juan was skilled and professional, but he was also conventional in his thinking, and limited by his jealousy and his need to suppress rivals. Sun Bin was innovative and creative, capable of seeing possibilities that others missed, and ultimately more successful, despite his physical limitations. The story suggested that intellectual and moral qualities mattered more than physical strength or conventional advantages. The Battle of Guiling also had immediate political consequences. Qi's successful intervention on behalf of Zhao, accomplished at relatively low cost through Sun Bin's indirect strategy, enhanced Qi's reputation and influence among the warring states. Other states recognized that Qi possessed not just military strength, but strategic sophistication, and that Qi was capable of projecting power in ways that were difficult to predict or counter. This reputation served Qi well in the complex diplomacy of the warring states period. For Wei, the defeat at Guiling was a significant setback, but not a catastrophic one. Wei remained one of the great powers, and it would continue to play a major role in the conflicts of the warring states period. But Wei's leadership learned from the experience. They became more cautious about overextending their forces. They became more aware of the need to defend their core territories, even while pursuing foreign objectives. And they developed a healthy respect for Qi's military capabilities and for Sun Bin's strategic genius. The strategic principles that Sun Bin demonstrated at Guiling would be refined and developed by subsequent military thinkers. The concept of indirect strategy, of achieving objectives through maneuver and positioning, rather than through direct confrontation, became central to Chinese military thought. The idea that the objective of strategy was to manipulate the enemy into a position of disadvantage, rather than simply to destroy the enemy's forces, became widely accepted, and the recognition that psychological factors understanding what the enemy values, what the enemy fears, and how the enemy will respond to threats could be as important as purely military factors became fundamental to how Chinese strategists approached warfare. Sun Bin's own writings on military strategy, preserved in texts that would later be known as The Art of War by Master Sun, expanded on the principles he had demonstrated at Guiling. These texts emphasize the importance of deception, the value of understanding terrain and positioning, the significance of timing and opportunity, and the necessity of adapting strategy to circumstances rather than following rigid formulas. Sun Bin's work, building on and extending the earlier writings of his ancestor Sun Wu, became one of the foundational texts of Chinese military theory. The Battle of Guiling also illustrated an important limitation of conventional military power. Wei had possessed the stronger army, the more professional military system, and the more advantageous strategic position. Yet all of these advantages had been neutralized by superior strategy. Wei's strength had been turned against it. The very fact that Wei had committed so many forces to the siege of Handan had left Wei's own territory vulnerable to attack. The principle that strength could become weakness, if it was deployed in the wrong place or at the wrong time, was a lesson that would resonate throughout military history. In the decades that followed Guiling, Sun Bin would demonstrate his strategic genius again in another famous battle, the Battle of Guiling, where he would again defeat Pang Juan, this time with even more devastating results. But it was Guiling that first established Sun Bin's reputation and that first demonstrated the principles of indirect strategy that would define his approach to warfare. Guiling was where Sun Bin proved that his physical limitations were irrelevant compared to his intellectual capabilities, and where he showed that sometimes the most powerful weapon in warfare was not the sword or the spear, but the mind that could see possibilities that others could not imagine. 3 centuries after Guiling, when the Han Dynasty was consolidating its rule over a unified China, scholars and military officers would still study the Battle of Guiling as an example of strategic excellence. They would analyze Sun Bin's decision-making, attempting to understand the principles that had guided his thinking. They would debate whether his success was the result of genius that could not be replicated, or whether it represented principles that could be learned and applied by others. And they would recognize that Guiling had contributed something fundamental to how Chinese civilization thought about strategy, about problem-solving, and about the relationship between direct force and indirect manipulation. The principle of besiege Wei to rescue Zhao transcended its military origins and became applicable to almost any situation where indirect approaches might be more effective than direct ones. In diplomacy, it suggested that the best way to influence a rival state might not be to negotiate with that state directly, but rather to create circumstances that would force that state to change its behavior. In politics, it suggested that the best way to achieve an objective might not be to pursue that objective directly, but rather to create conditions that would make the objective achievable as a secondary consequence of other actions. In any competitive situation, it suggested that understanding the opponent's priorities and constraints might allow for manipulation that would be more effective than direct confrontation. The Battle of Guiling stands as a monument to the power of strategic thinking and to the possibility that intellect and creativity can overcome conventional military advantages. Sun Bin, despite his physical limitations, and despite facing one of the most professional armies of the Warring States period, had achieved a decisive victory through superior strategy. He had saved Zhao without fighting at Zhao. He had defeated Wei without destroying Wei's army in a massive confrontation. He had accomplished his objectives efficiently and at relatively low cost through understanding the situation deeply and acting on that understanding with confidence and precision. For military strategists throughout history, Guiling has remained a case study in the art of indirect strategy. It demonstrates that the most direct path to an objective is not always the most effective path. It shows that understanding an enemy's priorities and vulnerabilities can allow a weaker force to manipulate a stronger one. It proves that the objective of strategy should be to accomplish political and military goals, rather than simply to win battles, and that sometimes those goals can be achieved without fighting the battles that the enemy expects you to fight. For students of Chinese history and culture, Guiling represents something equally important. It represents the value that Chinese civilization has traditionally placed on intellectual achievement and strategic thinking. Sun Bin was celebrated not because he was the strongest warrior or because he commanded the largest army, but because he could think more clearly and more creatively than his rivals. His physical limitations, which in many cultures might have disqualified him from military service entirely, were rendered irrelevant by his intellectual capabilities. The culture that produced and celebrated Sun Bin was a culture that recognized that the mind could be the most powerful weapon of all. 2.5 millennia have passed since Sun Bin stood at Guiling and watched his strategy unfold exactly as he had predicted. The states that competed in that long-ago conflict are memories. The specific military technologies and tactics they employed are obsolete. The details of troop movements and tactical decisions are matters of historical reconstruction. But the principles that Sun Bin demonstrated, that indirect approaches can be more effective than direct ones, that understanding the enemy matters more than overwhelming the enemy, that strategy matters more than strength, and that intellect can overcome physical force, these principles remain as relevant today as they were in 353 BCE. The Battle of Guiling stands as an enduring reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting the battle your enemy expects, but from changing the nature of the contest entirely, and that the most profound form of strength is the ability to see possibilities that others cannot imagine.